It is my great pleasure to host the final lecture of the second part of this year-long symposium on the Anthropocene, either or, that we launched in spring 2021, with a series of lectures by renowned theorists, artists, and philosophers, many of whom are faculty members at IDSVA. The symposium addresses, as you know, the role of art and philosophy in relation to questions of ecology, climate change, coexistence, and sustainability as an existential urgency of our times. And I am particularly proud of having been able to host this symposium in a year that remains heavily affected by the global pandemic, which forced us to cancel our many in-person residencies around the world, as we usually do, but offered us the opportunity to open up these lectures to a wider audience. So thanks again for being here with us. I see around 30 of you, which is great on this Saturday afternoon. Today we have the pleasure to host Dr. Ewa Ziarek, who will talk on the datafication of the world, Arendt, Natality, and the ontopolitics of big data. I wish to thank Professor Ziarek for being here and sharing her current scholarship with us. I have asked Dr. Karen Moscovich, a recent graduate of IDSVA, to introduce Dr. Ziarek today. I should say that Karen wrote her dissertation under Professor Ziarek's supervision, which is now under contract to be published as a book by Bloomsbury. Congratulations, Karen. With the title Radical Intimacy in Contemporary Art, Objection, Revolt, and Objecthood. So look out for that title in a couple of years, should be out. I would also like to thank Patricia Pinajero, who is a PhD candidate at IDSVA, and who will help us with the technicalities of this webinar. Thank you, Patricia. And also the administration and staff at IDSVA for their assistance throughout these lectures, and in particular, Molly Davis deserves a special thanks. I'll go over a few details of this webinar. The lecture will be recorded, as you know, and posted on our Vimeo channel. So a couple of days after the talk, you'll be able to watch the recording. The lecture will last approximately 50 minutes. We'll take questions from the audience following that. So, we plan to go for at least an hour and a half. Please write your questions in the Q&A box that you find at the bottom of the screen, and Karen will select the questions and read them to Professor Ziarek. So without further ado, I'd like to leave the podium to Karen Moscovich. Thank you very much and enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Simonetta. It is my deep honor to introduce a scholar, educator, and activist who has had such a profound impact on my own transition from student to professional. I was incredibly fortunate to have Professor Ziarek as my dissertation advisor and to spend 2+ years under her patient and incisive mentorship. Her understanding of the entangled engagements between feminism, psychoanalysis, political theory, and of course, works of art and literature not only helped crystallize and propel my own research, but opened my eyes to a world of contemporary thought that holds a particular resonance in today's social and political landscape. Ewa Plonowska Ziarek is Julian Park Professor of Comparative Literature at SUNY Buffalo, a Senior Research Fellow of Philosophy at Western Sydney University, and most important to us here today, visiting faculty at the Institute for Doctoral Studies in Visual Arts. Her recently published book, co-authored with Rosalind Diprose, Arendt, Natality, and Biopolitics Towards Democratic Plurality and Reproductive Justice, was awarded Book Prize of Symposium, Canadian Journal for Continental Philosophy. In this volume, Diprose and Ziarek explore the co-presence of the recurring restrictions of human plurality, with attempts to restrict women's reproductive self-determination. This question has only become more prescient in these last few months. Her other books include Feminist Aesthetics and the Politics of Modernism, An Ethics of Dissensus, Feminism, Postmodernity, and the Politics of Radical Democracy, The Rhetoric of Failure, Deconstruction of Skepticism, Reinvention of Modernism, and co-edited volumes such as Intermedialities, Philosophy, Art, Politics, Time for the Humanities, and Revolt, Affect, Collectivity, The Unstable Boundaries of Kristeva's Polis. In her new research project, her focus shifts to a feminist analysis of the increasingly global political regime of digital capital and algorithmic governmentality. In today's talk, Professor Ziarek examines the contrast between Arendt's ontology of neutrality and the political ontology at stake in the datafication of the world. Without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce Professor Ewa Ziarek.
Thank you so much, Karen. I should say that I've learned so much from Karen, who pushed me toward the object-related ontologies and to think more about the materiality of the world. So it was a mutual dialogical project that benefits both of us. But I've always been motivated by Arendt's question to think about what we, however we understand ourselves, what we are doing. And that propelled me to jump into a topic for which I'm not very well equipped in terms of technological how-to, namely to think about what is happening with increasing datafication of the world and the hegemony of algorithmic governmentality, machine learning, and big data. So this talk is in 3 parts, and the first part is called A New Referendum on Reality. In a February 2020 article in The Atlantic, entitled The $1 Billion Disinformation Campaign to Re-elect the President, McKay Coppins offers disturbing insights into digital techniques of power based on the extraction of big data for the purposes of micro-political advertising and voter behavioral modification. Developed by Cambridge Analytica in 2016, the temporal and geopolitical relevance of these technologies of power extends well beyond 2020 US campaign and its aftermath. Alarmed by the staggering amount of data extracted from voters and social media users without their consent or awareness, Coppins concludes that the ultimate damage of these technologies is not only a widely discussed political crisis of democracy, but primarily the loss of a shared reality. As he puts it, should it prevail in 2020, the election's legacy will be clear, not a choice between parties or candidates or policy platforms, but rather a referendum on reality itself. And I was struck by this this articulation of the stakes, a referendum on reality. More and more frequently discussed by computer scientists, political theorists, and wider public alike, these worries about a loss of reality have not only prevailed, but in fact intensified. As data and computer scientist Sanal Aral puts it in a nutshell, we are approaching, quote unquote, the end of reality. With the waning of techno-optimism and the ascendancy of techno-dystopianism, numerous diagnoses have been offered for this state of affairs, ranging from the widely discussed post-truth societies and the blurring of the differences between reality and hyperreality to the critiques of digital capitalism. However, this public and therefore political concern about the loss of reality also foregrounds the ontological effects of the digital regime of power. In order to develop such ontopolitics of big data, I draw on Hannah Arendt's central claim that any loss of reality is intertwined with historically specific assaults on human plurality. Although best known for her writings on totalitarianism, Arendt herself has interrogated the destruction of human plurality by multiple low-tech and high-tech technologies of domination, ranging from imperialism, anti-Semitism, racism, to refugee crisis, or even religious otherworldly communities. So following Arendt, I want to think about the ontological and political stakes of a current referendum on reality and analyze how the continuing historical threats to human plurality are automated and encoded anew in the digital technologies of power. Since for Arendt, the ontological loss of realness is not merely an effect of the changing regime of truth, but intertwined with the historically specific political threats to worldly appearance of human plurality, let us ask first how she understands such pluralism, that will be in the second part of my talk, and second, how new digital technologies of power endanger it. With the emphasis on inhabiting and acting in a common world, plurality for Arendt is not a numerical multitude of isolated individuals, but rather a deeply relational form of sociality characterized by the enabling tension between equality and distinction, between being in common and the unrepeatable singularity of persons. It is through shared deeds and words, action, judgments, and stories that human agents in the world are capable of disclosing their uniqueness to others and enacting with them a new beginning in political life. Whenever this worldly appearance of equality, distinction, and uniqueness of person is under assault by political technologies of power, it's not only the ethical and political damage that we have to grapple with, but we also have to account for the loss of the sense of reality. For Arendt, this notion of realness, dependent on human plurality, corresponds to the ontology of natality. By contrast, insofar as the algorithmic processing of big data is subordinated to the economic aims of digital capitalism and the automation of political decisions, its ontology corresponds to what I call digital wordlessness. Such digital wordlessness is both presupposed and re-enacted by algorithmic governmentality, a term proposed by Antoinette Rouvroy and Thomas Byrne, which Rouvroy herself defines as, quote unquote, a regime of neutralization, aiming to disarm and neutralize subjective capacities for action, speech, decision, as well as collective imaginations of political projects. The contrast between these ontologies could not be more stark, but it reflects the hybrid and therefore antagonistic character of our current referendum on reality. Thinking through this ontopolitical antagonism as reflective of larger technologies of power, we can avoid what Ruha Benjamin calls a reductive opposition between techno-determinism and techno-utopianism, which promises to solve all social inequalities. Since realness for Arendt is so closely related to the worldly condition of human plurality, it cannot be assured by factual knowledge or objectivity abstracted from human affairs. As she writes, factual truth is always related to other people. It concerns events and circumstances in which many are involved. It is established by witnesses and depends upon testimony. It is political by nature. As is now more clear than ever, even the authority of science, not to mention the authority of politics, rests on public trust or on what Arendt rehabilitates in her political writings as common sense. In her lectures on Kant, Arendt argues that insofar as common sense reflects human plurality, it is one of the highest political virtues, which should not be automatically disregarded as unreflective public opinion of ideologically manipulated masses. On the contrary, common sense depends on judgment and is related to human plurality and realness. In other words, both the political and ontological sense of the real emerges from sharing, acting, and engaging with others who are mutually regarded as equal and distinct. As she puts it, common sense presupposes a common world into which we fit and vice versa. Another of Arendt's insights with relevance to contemporary referendum on reality lies in her diagnosis of a Western political and scientific solution to the loss of reality, namely in substitution of common sense by calculation. Arendt calls this politically motivated substitution of calculation for common sense logicality, in order to distinguish it from the uses of statistics and computation in other domains. As she powerfully argues in her reflections on the rise of statistics, calculation becomes both a symptom of and a substitute for the lost reality because of its paradoxical double quality. On the one hand, the capacity for logic, like sensus communis, is common to all. But on the other hand, its validity is utterly abstracted from historical world, phenomenality of appearances, and ordinary language. As she puts it, all self-evidence from which logical reasoning proceeds can claim a reliability altogether independent of the world and the existence of other people, and only under conditions where the common realm between people is destroyed and the only reliability left consists in the meaninglessness of the tautologies of logic, can people accept logicality as the substitute for common understanding. Although a comprehensive analysis of digital threats to human plurality and the sense of realness requires multiple methodological perspectives, in this talk, I want to focus on this ontological conflict between formalization of knowledge inherent in algorithmic procedures abstracted from the phenomenal world and the difficulties of understanding emerging from human plurality. At stake in these political ontologies is not a resolution or a possible choice, but rather the question, very difficult question, of whether this conflict can be mobilized to help us reimagine different possibilities for political and cultural uses of data in support for the struggles of freedom or equality, or whether the big data revolution, so often described in terms of, in fact, ecological disaster as tsunami, explosion, or flood, will aggravate our sense of digital wordlessness. So now it's the second part on Arendt's political ontology of natality. As numerous interpreters of Arendt have argued, one of her main contributions to political theory is her famous claim that the ontology of natality is a central category of political thought. As she writes, all human activities are rooted in natality. However, action has the closest connection with the human condition of natality. The new beginning inherent in birth can make itself felt in the world only because the newcomer possesses the capacity of beginning something new, that is, of acting. Moreover, since action is a political activity par excellence, natality and not mortality may be the central category of political thought, end of quote. For Arendt, the condition of natality, the condition of having been born into the historical world, carries three interrelated meanings. First of all, it is as a crucial but overlooked modality of finitude, natality emphasizes a deeply relational, interdependent notion of personhood. From birth, we appear first to others than to ourselves, and therefore human uniqueness and plurality are inseparable. Because uniqueness and plurality can be brutally destroyed by political exploitation, natality refers to political ontology. Second, natality stresses the fact that phenomenological appearance of newcomers and strangers in the historical world is the event of a new beginning. Already at work in the first order of birth, the possibility of such a new beginning occurs again and again, wherever political agents act in concert with each other. To sum up, the ontology of natality is characterized by interrelational political agency, the enactment of a new beginning in the world through acting with others, and the disclosure of agents' uniqueness through words and deeds. These three interrelated aspects of sociality and realness, disclosure of uniqueness, reenactment of human plurality, and sharing of words and judgments are most endangered in the context of the algorithmic processing of big data. As many of Arendt's interpreters point out, unrepeatable singularity is not the same as having an individual identity in isolation from others. On the contrary, it is a mode of appearance to and with others. Since uniqueness not only contests any discriminatory politics of classification, but also exceeds general attributes of our collective identifications, it cannot be defined, but merely implied in form of a welcoming address to another. Who are you? And any answer to such a question, either in the form of sociopolitical classification or even self-definition, is necessarily general, shared by others. For instance, when I say I am an Eastern European feminist, there are many Eastern European feminists, right, who can claim that affiliation. And therefore, such self-definition slides into general attributes of identity, what Arendt calls whatness of identity. Consequently, the irreducible paradox of uniqueness lies in the fact that despite its opacity and recalcitrance to generality of meaning, it is nonetheless communicated to others. Consequently, what characterizes the political aesthetic mode of disclosure of uniqueness in action and language is the irreducible tension between exposure to others and opacity to ourselves, between the inexpressible singularity and the generality of norms. A key consequence of this disclosure of singularity in the midst of human plurality is that it foregrounds implicitly or explicitly the appeal to the judgment of others. To develop this role of judgment, a number of critics tend to Arendt's political reinterpretation of Kant's critique of judgment and stress its importance for democratic politics, feminist politics, and aesthetics. In her highly idiosyncratic readings of Kant, Arendt proposes an analogy between aesthetic judgments of art and the political judgments of historians and witnesses of public events. Ultimately, what is at stake in this analogy between aesthetic, political, and historical judgments is the most tenuous type of public communication of unrepeatable particulars. This event, this person, this work of art, without treating them as illustration of general concepts, empirical data, or mathematical abstractions. Just as the attributes of identity, which can be easily communicated to others, cannot account for human uniqueness, so too aesthetic norms of beauty cannot explain why this artwork or landscape is beautiful or moving, or nor can democratic political ideals of freedom and equality tell us how we should act and judge in particular case. Consequently, in her interpretation of Kant's philosophy of reflective judgment, Arendt finds a mode of sharing with others of what is in fact incommunicable, uniqueness refractory to general norms. By reflecting singularity through the appeal to the judgments of others, and thus foregrounding interdependence of uniqueness and plurality, this mode of communication is what Arendt claims as Kant's greatest political discovery. Arendt's recovery of the public communication of judgments and public communication of the opacity of uniqueness is even more urgent for our political moment, characterized by the convergence of digital capitalism and the automation of public decisions. As Andreevich argues, the processing of big data by automated system destroys not only communicability of reflective judgment, but in fact all public explanations and justifications of knowledge itself. Bypassing the challenges of communicability of judgments that hold human plurality together, communication in the case of big data or algorithmic decision is all too often limited to the announcements and implementations of the outcomes of algorithmic operations, to the exclusion of the processes by which they are derived. For instance, the choice of the problem to be solved, its mathematical formalization, the type of algorithms used, the source and type of available training data, and so forth. Consequently, numerous decisions encoded in data mining and machine learning pipeline remain withdrawn from public understanding and contestation. Produced without public comprehension, these semi-oracular numerical outcomes aim to replace judgment, contestation, and political imagination of alternative possibilities. This brings me to the third part of my talk called Datafication, and the political ontology of digital wordlessness. So we need to ask, what happens to the key characteristics of Arendt's ontology of natality, in particular to this communication of singularity, the event of new beginning, and the affirmation of human plurality in this new regime of power when sharing of words and deeds is either replaced or undermined by algorithmic decisions. Despite its many historical genealogies, the historical processing of big data, working together with digital capital on the global scale, represents an unprecedented phenomenon, which the proponents of AI do not hesitate to call a new technopolitical revolution. Yet, as scholars working in the fields of science and technology, Black studies, legal studies, and economics points out, the significance of this revolution is contestable once we examine the imbrication of the old and new technologies of knowledge in the context of power, racialization, and coloniality. As suggested by the growing vocabulary of new critical terms, such as the new Jim Code, surveillance capitalism, algorithmic governmentality, societies of control, surrogate humanity, digital poorhouse, and even my own digital wordlessness, these new technologies both encode historical structures of domination and facilitate the emergence of unprecedented forms of power and knowledge. What are therefore the main features of this configuration of power in the computational age, and how do they contribute to digital wordlessness? To answer these questions, I propose to start with a kind of public or publicity-like techno-revolutionary account of big data offered by Mayer, Schomburg, and Zucker in their 2014 New York Times bestseller, Big Data, a Revolution That Will Transform How We Live, Work, and Think. Because this book popularizes and reveals the most contested elements of the new regime of power, almost inadvertently so, and at the same time depoliticizes them by treating them merely as affordances of new scientific technologies. So let us look therefore at the main characteristics at the big data, the sort of famous 4 V's, volume, variety, velocity, and velocity refers to the dynamism of data continuously updated and tracked in real time, and veracity or truthfulness in terms of these new technologies of power. While acknowledging the darker side of data, Mayer, Schomburg, and Zucker begin their revolutionary account with the quasi-sublime volume of big data and its epistemic aspiration to include the totality of empirical knowledge of the world. Since the multitude of data approaches n equals all, that is the whole set, the traditional statistical sampling might no longer be required. However, this exponential volume and velocity of data continuously updated in real time is facilitated not only by digitalization and the advancement of computational technologies, but, as we shall see, by the politics of ubiquitous digital surveillance. Since the scale of big data extracted through surveillance exceeds human comprehension and communication, this overload of information has to be processed through often proprietary algorithms, which in turn introduce a new form of secrecy into the public sphere. In addition to scale and speed, the most contestable ideological assertion of big data lies in the self-evidence of its truth, in its veracity. Big data claims to speak for itself and to reveal a new form of objectivity, which, as Burns and Rouvroy point out, seems to emerge immanently from life itself. This veracity depends, first of all, on the shift of scientific perspective away from reasons, explanations, historical genealogies, and all forms of causality, including the causality of power and freedom, to so abandonment of the explanations of why something is the case to the discovery of what is the case on the basis of correlations found by machine learning algorithms. Since the algorithmic discovery of correlations or anomalies in huge data sets requires neither explanation nor prior scientific hypothesis testing, big data announces the end of theory, not in sciences themselves, and not merely in humanities. And that, of course, corresponds to the end of philosophy. Needless to say, the veracity and objectivity of big data have been contested by numerous interdisciplinary scholars, including computer scientists, the majority of whom are women and women of color, such as Sophia Umoja Noble, Cathy O'Neill, Simone Brown, Virginia Eubanks, and Shoshana Zuboff. The initial justification that mathematical neutrality of big data and machine learning could counter sociopolitical prejudices, even if it were possible, is problematic in and of itself, because it repeats the hyper-realist dream of transcending human conflicts, desires, and embeddedness in the world. Yet, as the groundbreaking work of these critical data scholars demonstrates only too well, big data and artificial intelligence not only reproduce harms and discriminations, but also make it more difficult to contest them. Numerous explanations have been proposed by this state of affairs. A, technologies are never neutral tools, but because they are always imbricated in economic and socio-political operations of power. B, social data used for machine training is shaped by the long-standing history of systemic racial, economic, and gender injustices, what Ruha Benjamin in her work calls double coding. And C, the emergence of new hierarchies of power knowledge between those who have the economic, political, and intellectual capital to design algorithmic models and communities subjected to unregulated algorithmic decisions. Yet, as I tried to argue in this talk, there is another harm of big data that I want to underscore, namely the loss of the shared world. Acting and speaking, consider this neologism, data speaks for itself, acting and speaking in abstraction from phenomenal and historical world, the efficiency of big data technologies depends on the rejection of facticity and ambiguity of both ordinary and scientific languages for the sake of mathematical formalization of empirical facts and their translation into machine computability. As Meyer, Schomburg, and Zucker put it, the revolution of big data is ultimately not about the size, but about the ability to quantify the heterogeneity of the world so that quantification becomes synonymous with understanding. That is why they propose to replace the word data with a more precise and now widely used neologism, datafication. By purging the term data from its lingering etymological references to Latin datum, that is, to the heterogeneity of what is given, datafication conveys the destructive agency of data mining, which consists in the reduction of this irreducible heterogeneity of phenomenological appearances into quantifiable variety. Evocative of imperialist and racist conquests, the violent rhetoric of datafication emphasizes the power and the desire to capture what is given into quantifiable information. Like the quantification of human being in different regimes of racialization, the so-called variety of big data, in fact, finally transforms heterogeneity of human and non-human phenomena into quantifiable information, which can be measured by using tools of statistics and algorithms, recorded, stored in data warehouses, and retrieved by using digital processors. At first glance, such datafication resonates with Arendt's notion of logicality replacing common sense, since both logicality and datafication are abstracted from phenomenology of appearances, events, and ordinary language. However, as we shall see in our discussion of algorithmic secrecy, the key difference consists in the fact that datafication departs even from the common capacity for logic. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that, as Meyer and Schomburg and Zucker suggest in passing, datafication entails a new ontological attitude to the world. As they write, we no longer regard our world as a string of happenings that we explain as natural or social phenomena, but as universe comprised essentially of information, end of quote. Because it is abstracted from the irreducible heterogeneity of phenomena, events, and historical social interactions, the ontopolitics of big data is precisely what constitutes digital wordlessness. The destructive character of such wordlessness is perhaps most dramatically, if again metaphorically, conveyed by the words of a computer scientist, Chris Re, who in 2021 underscores the voracious character of data processed by machine learning. I quote, "Software has been eating the world for the last 10 years. In the last few years, a new phenomenon has started to emerge. Machine learning is eating software," end of quote. Since for Arendt, the shared sense of reality and the world are so closely intertwined with ontological commitment to human plurality, digital wordlessness goes hand in hand with its destruction. And indeed, this is what is at stake in the datafication of social relations. As Meyer, Schomburg, and Zucker candidly admit, what is at stake in big data analytics, subordinated to the aims of digital capital, is the transformation of all human interactions and activities, values, moods, friendships, actions, stories, artworks, and interpretations into calculable quantities. Once datafied, social media platforms, for example, that's their quote, don't simply offer us a way to find and stay in touch with friends and colleagues, but transform everyday relations into the lucrative currency of data, which can be sold, treated as signals for investments, used for profiling, and turned into predictions about our future. And such voracious profit-driven transformation of social relations and human plurality into datafication is indeed what renders the meaning of the common world semantically poor, if economically lucrative, and by extension constitutes the poverty of data science, to paraphrase Marx's famous indictment of the poverty of philosophy. Because the volume and velocity of big data depends on the pervasive digital surveillance and algorithmic secrecy, datafication of social relations on the global scale undermines the commons and the public and counter-public spheres where human plurality can manifest itself. In what sense do the affordances of big data and machine learning technologies constitute a new type of surveillance? How do they encode, automate, and augment the historical, well-familiar apparatuses of surveillance, which have been disproportionately used to target racialized minorities, political dissidents, immigrants, refugees, or whole populations subjected to biopolitical normalization? In one of the first theoretical accounts of the new power relations emerging from this confluence of digital surveillance and capital, Frank Pascal argues that public sphere, together with its legal apparatus, is fractured into multiple black box societies. One of the most familiar metaphors in both the description and critique of big data and machine learning algorithm, the black box is usually a shorthand for the lack of algorithmic transparency. In Pascal's work, however, black boxing has a deeper meaning, as it refers to the digital technology of power, which combines surveillance, secrecy, capital, and political control. It refers, first of all, to the plethora of recording devices embedded in cars, phones, GPSs, biometric sensors, cameras, ubiquitous Internet of Things, border crossings, policing, workplaces, homes, and smart technologies harvesting data without users' awareness or consent, enabling the continuous tracking of things, people, and matter on an unprecedented scale and in real time. Such pervasive digital extraction of data constitutes a dispersed network of power relations, which Kevin Haggerty and Richard Erickson call surveillance assemblages, in order to distinguish them from top-down models of the Orwellian Big Brother or the Foucauldian panopticon. The second aspect of black boxing, which undermines publicity and any sense of commonness, is algorithmic secrecy, or the widely discussed lack of transparency in machine learning algorithms. Such secrecy means not only the lack of authorized access to proprietary algorithms of megacorporations, or the lack of technical expertise to understand them, but also the complexity of machine learning algorithms exceeding human understanding altogether, including understanding of experts themselves, as is the case with the neural networks used in controversial facial recognition technologies. And it is in this sense that algorithmic secrecy goes beyond logicality, which still carries the sense of common capacity for logic. By understanding the power of by underscoring the power of algorithmic secrecy and digital surveillance, the notion of black boxing refers to an organization or mode of governmentality where, I quote, the analysis and the use of data is opaque and unchallengeable, especially by those who are discriminated by their results. Revising this analysis in the context of algorithmic encoding of racial inequalities, Uha Benjamin renames the black box as anti-black box and points out that this power structure constitutes a new digital Jim code regime of racialization. By destabilizing public-private common singular distinction, such datafication of the world undermines the relational character of human plurality on global scale. One of its main mechanisms consists in ranking and sorting individuals through digital profiling and user personalizations. Capturing even the most fleeting interactions, algorithmically generated digital group profiles utterly disregard shared worldly attributes of belonging to different communities, the whatness in Arendt's sense of the world, whereas automated personalizations destroy the unrepeatable human uniqueness. As Rouvroy and Burns similarly point out, digital profiling and personalizations are indifferent to both the singularity of persons and their political engagements. Although some profiles are still generated on the basis of professional, racial, religious, and political affiliations, most digital profiling, in fact, bypasses shared affiliations altogether and construct arbitrary assemblages based on correlations and patterns discovered in huge data sets by machine learning algorithms. The subsequent algorithmic attribution of such group profiles to individual users, regardless of the fact of whether or not their individual data was in fact used to construct these profiles, is what constitutes the so-called personalization, most readily apparent in all kinds of automated recommendations of what one should watch, buy, follow, and like, and the least discernible in the automated exclusion from social goods and life chances. As Burns and Rouvroy point out, the power of digital profiling targets subjects not only through disciplining their bodies, but through its predictive, invisible, or secret, in my analysis, rankings generated by these signifying machines. I'll skip a little bit and conclude that although I agree with Rouvroy, Stigler, and Zuboff, and Rouvroy and Burns' different assertions about the unprecedented power of digital technologies of data, their accounts are nonetheless limited by the lack of robust genealogical analysis of its emergence. In particular, I contest Stigler's contention that the advent of automated society ushers in, I quote, absolute novelty. Such an argument risks inverting a techno-revolutionary narrative with which I began this section into its dialectical counterpart, namely a dystopian narrative of the absolute break produced by techno-determinism. However, if we follow critical race and decolonial theorists, for instance, Ruha Benjamin and Simone Brown, who argue that these new technologies of power are conditioned, in the Arendtian sense of the word, in my understanding, by long histories of racial profiling and surveillance, colonialism, biometrics, and biopolitics, then we need to consider much more difficult and troubling political questions. Namely, how is algorithmic governmentality automating existing inequalities on the enterprise scale and expanding them to groups so far protected by their privilege, such as whiteness, heteronormativity, and ableism? And how do these technological affordances produce new forms of power, no longer operating on the basis of statistical normalizations or ideological justifications? By stressing both the genealogical continuities and the unprecedented character of digital wordlessness, this double perspective avoids legitimate criticism that blaming all forms of discrimination on AI ignores other low-tech but equally pervasive social inequalities. But I want to end a little bit on a positive note. The only way we can counter digital wordlessness is by severing the subservience of big data and machine learning to digital capital and algorithmic governmentality, and reimagine the possibility of deploying these technologies for equity and freedom. And here too, a genealogical research can assist us in such an endeavor, as Ruha Benjamin demonstrates in the context of Black struggles to reclaim data for the purposes of liberation from racism. And I quote, "There is a long tradition of employing and challenging data for Black lives. However, before the data, they were, for Du Bois and Wells Barnett and many others, the political questions and commitments to Black freedom," end of quote. Drawing on such traditions would entail the reassertion of the priority of political commitments to freedom and justice, and reclaiming a possibility of a new beginning. In order to end again on a more optimistic note, I would like to suggest that such commitment to freedom and justice is at stake in the emerging new social movements, such as Algorithmic Justice League or Data for Black Lives, and their political struggle over collective governments and community-based use of data. Often started by computer scientists and statisticians, and in overwhelming majority by women and people of color, these organizations reclaim collective action, public debate, stories, and artistic practices as indispensable modes for reimagining different possibilities of the political uses of data. By challenging digital harms and digital wordlessness, these new movements use data both as the target and as a means of political contestation. As the manifesto for Data for Black Lives proclaims, the politics of data can be imagined and mobilized otherwise. We can, for example, imagine data as protest, data as accountability, data as collective action. By reframing data within the horizon of justice, these political initiatives create new connections between action, machine learning, publicity, art, and imagination in order to provide a blueprint for new forms of political activism and critical reflection. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ewa. And let me invite Professor George Smith to this panel. Professor Smith is the president and founder of IDSVA, and he wanted to be included in this discussion. So thank you so much again. I would like to invite everybody to write their questions on the Q&A. Hello, George.
Hi there, Simonetta. Hi, everybody. And Ewa, what a terrific presentation. Just stunning, as you always promised to be. And I can't begin to thank you enough for the contribution you've made, not just to this discussion, but to the world in general and all of the work that you've done over these decades. Major contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you, George. That means a lot. We're like partners in crime. I try to follow George.
Yes. Hi, everybody else. Yeah. Good stuff.
Hello, George. Well, since everybody always asks for the bibliography, this time we have thought about it ahead of time. So Professor Ziarek kindly sent me the bibliography for her talk, which is very extensive. I tried to paste it in the chat, but it didn't work. So I have uploaded it as a text file. I hope you can see it and download it. If there is any problem with that, let me know and we'll try another way. But I'm sure that you will find many interesting points there to deepen, with the reading of those texts. Karen, would you like to take questions?
Yes, absolutely. So as we're waiting for our audience members to collect their questions, I have a few myself, and I thought maybe I'd start us off. Professor Ziarek, you kind of started touching upon this both in your conclusion to the talk and also in the final chapter of the recent book, and it really caught my attention and opened up so many questions, which is, how does the datafication of the world impact the role of objects as materiality, which support memories and actions which rely on memory and narrative? So is there a shift that's happening in the role of the object, both art object and otherwise, that is somehow being facilitated by the shift towards big data and datafication of logic?
I think there is, and I tried to look at the other side of the equation on the impact on sociality, but I think there is an equally destructive relation to objects in the world. And in this context, I would like to suggest perhaps Shoshana Zuboff's sense that datafication repeats at scale the sort of violent use or approach to the environment and the world as merely a resource, and adds to that human or personhood as a second-degree resource. So in effect, it's a kind of intensification of approach to the world and other human beings as resources for the datafication and data as currency. And in this context, I was thinking about that someone should do a maybe more in-depth analysis of the metaphorics of big data. And it perked my attention because of the context on Anthropocene of this lecture series. Why is this revolutionary break of big data presented as natural or catastrophe or climate change of catastrophe, tsunami, right, flood, and so forth, or as this kind of, on the other part is the whole references to food, data as bacon, data as new, or as resource, data as new oil, and so forth. And it seems that all of this has in common this approach to objects, persons, social relations, natural relations, as first of all, resources for digital capital. And second is this sort of distraction of phenomenal appearances of both objects in the world and human beings. So that is, datafication completely abstracts from the sense of what is given, of an opacity of the object, its appearance to us as other, or opacity, phenomenological opacity of the appearance of the singularity of human beings, right?
Thank you so much. I think the idea of the abstraction away from the materiality of the object and the materiality, even the materiality of human relations, seems to also echo the problematics of the Kantian sensus communis, even as Arendt is trying to rehabilitate it in a different kind of way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely, and abstraction from bodies.
Yeah, yeah.
Embodiment.
Does anyone else from our audience or panel have any additional questions? I certainly have more, but I hope that I thought George might have one. I could feel it.
I'll kick in here. Of course, I'm sure there are many, many questions. Mine is more of a provocation than anything else. You mentioned that datafication will more or less means the erasure of philosophy, precisely insofar as datafication is information and philosophy moves toward meaning, which is grounded in hermeneutics. Be that as it may, implicit in what you say is the question of analytic philosophy and where that goes, because it seems to me that what you're suggesting is analytic philosophy disappears into science, while at the same time philosophy, or continental philosophy as we call it in the West, disappears into annihilation vis-a-vis calculation and measure or identification. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's very important. I mean, that is meant, I read this claim more as a manifesto and a political approach, the end of theory in sciences, which I say, well, it's the end of philosophy, as very contestable and necessary claim that is indeed characteristic of certain analytical philosophy, or its sort of loving embrace of computational ontologies, just like a case in my own university, computational ontology, right? And therefore proclamation that philosophy is no longer a part of humanities, but in fact a social science, right? So yes, this is the kind of predictable drift once you depart from the sense of why question.
Yes, yes, meaning.
The meaning question, or even wonder, or even opacity of meaning, or difficulties of understanding into, because that's, well, is antithetical to the automation of decisions, judgments, and automation of thinking, in fact, by algorithmic procedures.
I have a follow-up question. Do you mind, Karen?
Please.
So to bring that back, Ewa, and forgive me for going on with this, but I'm particularly interested in this. It seems to me that a lot of the teen suicides that have now become epidemic, at least in the United States and in the West, had to do with the datafication of human being insofar as kids that don't see themselves fitting in with the notion of human being as information as opposed to meaning and wonderment, as you put it. That is, kids that are uncertain as opposed to deterministically clear as to how they do fit in. And this is particularly true of young girls, of course. How do you tie that phenomenon into the discussion that you have so courageously given us today?
I think that we would need to add another phenomenon of the infrastructure of social media that is meant, and so again, a very interesting contradiction, that is meant to amplify addiction and time devoted to staying online, right? And and therefore the behavioral research into what amplifies this kind of addiction and what amplifies kind of posting and reposting of messages. And invariably, the more outrageous, the more negative, the more destructive the message, the more frequently it is forwarded. And even when we righteously disagree with it, it's that's, you know, the primary kind of affect is either narcissistic. It's almost like going back to Kleinian paranoid schizoid position. It's either like or dislike, right? Yeah. There's no reparative mode in this, if I could go. So, but it is sort of built into the architecture of the modality of communication. And if you're, I think it's, in my sense, not yet elaborated, so this is impressionistic, this repeats this like dislike, you know, button. It's without reflection and leads to bullying and aggression on the line and so forth. It allows, of course, forming of counter communities, people, finding people who on and through a line that might be committed to other ends, but the architecture of the platforms rewards and therefore polarizes into this, what is extremely good and what is extremely aggressive. And ultimately both are aggressive. I mean, you just put a quote from, say, Arendt on your on whatever social media you are using, unless you belong to a group toward of philosophers, see how many reposts it will generate. And therefore, but not only that, the cycle is more pernicious because it might generate less, because algorithmic calculability or prediction, each post and repost depends on algorithmic prediction, gives it a low probability of being reposted. It might not even show up in the newsfeed of your followers. So algorithms are trained on the basis of data of what is being reposted, and almost like put it at the bottom of your newsfeed, you might never see it. When I started on Facebook, until I was kicked out of it by the ingenious claim that I was impersonating myself, algorithm kind of accused me of that crime. Self-impersonation. I was very naive. I never thought that the posts that I was seeing were dependent on the algorithmic prediction and not on the frequency of posting from the people. That so I said, oh, this person is very active online, and I've never heard from so-and-so, but I never, went to their website, their postings and site to see what they're posting, in fact.
I would just add, by the way, that I think it was Arendt who was first to see modern technology media as an addictive force in political momentum. Yeah. Thank you.
This is so interesting. If I may ask a question here, not really a question, but your talk, Ewa, and also the last question that George posed made me think of another lecture we had a couple of years ago by Franco Bifo Berardi at Spannocchia residency, when he was talking about the change that is occurring in the language, the way we apprehend language. And for the first time, he said, he also wrote about this in one of his books, but I remember when he said that for the first time, we're now learning the language no longer from our mothers, right? The famous mother tongue that we all learn from our caretakers, but we learn it from machines. And so I was wondering if, this ontological shift that you describe between the digital wordlessness and the ontological natality, I wonder if there may be a corresponding anthropological shift that we may see, in the future generation. I mean, we're all old enough to be kind of hybrids, but really more on the other side. But, I often wonder what's going to be of the children of today as they learn so many words. I mean, just the very idea of language, coming from a machine.
In a certain way, we could say, because I would resist naturalization of language. I think language is a social institution and it is a certain kind of technology, but it is very different, perhaps, than machine learning technology. And I think I would slightly disagree with the claim that we are no longer learn language from our mothers. I don't think we only learn language from our mothers, but from the immediate whatever kinship structures. But it's true, and that the first meaningful interactions are not even linguistic, but affective and bodily, right? It's, it's the caress, it's the touch, it's the response to the scream, it's this gratuitous smile, and I kind of wonder, never wrote about this, why the first meaningful form of expression in the sociality of the new human being, personhood, is a smile. A gratuitous smile is a big milestone when you respond with a smile and not just a scream at discomfort in the other. And I don't think that that for me is a form of language as well. Now we have, and we've always had technological recordings and so forth, and now they're more and more talking animals and games and so forth. But I would contest that claim. It's too totalizing for me. I think it's more hybrid, more nuanced. We're not yet at the dystopian stage when robots are taking care of the newborns and so forth, but it does point to a more interesting condition, which forgot the names, but they are on my list, bibliographical. There's a very interesting book called Surrogate Humanity, and how the notion of surrogacy, once again, this kind of double encoding here, has worked on low-tech and high-tech levels, and how in fact the new robotics that claim to serve or become surrogates for care or for service or secretaries reproduce the conditions of servitude and slavery on a technological level, and how often our conception of personhood is a kind of surrogate effect of designating objects or human beings to the position of non-personhood. And to what extent, now the whole debate of whether robots or machine learning agents will have rights or no rights points to this dynamic of surrogacy, which I think would be very, very interesting in the context that you are putting, which is absolutely new, in the context of language. Because, I mean, you could say that, especially in America, in the past, many children, and not only in America, did not learn in Europe, in affluent families, did not learn language from their mothers, but from nannies, from usually either in America from Black slaves, in Europe from servants, even the surrogacy in breastfeeding and so forth. So that's why I think for me, this notion of double encoding that Bruja Benjamin proposes is so useful, because it forces us to look for the encoding, say, of surrogacy by low-tech systems of power and oppression, and now how now they are automated and turned into artificial intelligence encoding. Does that make sense? It's more like thinking with you rather than proposing an answer, more like sketching out the horizon in which this question needs to be posed.
Mm-hmm. And one of our audience members has also offered, maybe at the individuation stage of development, this techno language is affective and needs studying.
Mm-hmm. 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 I think that's a good comment.
Yeah. Ewa, I wonder if I could ask maybe a complicated and provocative question here towards the end, which is a question that's been burning in my mind since I picked up your book. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on the pro-life, or really the anti-abortion feminist movement specifically, in regards to the plurality of natality, and how the use of data is being used both at the level of the Supreme Court. The use of data and the use of this sort of Kantian notion of sensus communis is being used to interpret the law in order to bolster both the anti-abortion and the pro-choice positions. And how are these narratives that are being generated by data, but also narratives which data is sort of being used as almost like a cudgel, or a weapon almost. How are these narratives reinforcing those political actions? So there's a few questions kind of embedded in my question, but just bringing it back to this extremely, I think, just burning issue that we're all currently observing unfolding in real time.
Yeah, I didn't foresee when we were writing this book, it was was more proleptic, that this issue will become so unfortunately relevant. I think, and it's not an easy question to answer, and the rush to escape the perplexities by arming ourselves with data is precisely the symptom of avoidance and violence. My own sense, because census communities does not mean majority of opinion, right? At all. It means this risk and possibility of exposing ourselves to others before we formulate our own judgments, even if we end up rejecting those judgments. But it is, it's informed by imagination and putting oneself in this kind of deep sense of displacement of how, say, my self-righteousness assertions and so forth might be challenged and why, right? So it's not it's not consensus. Sensus communis is not consensus by any, and I would like to distinguish these two. There can be a consensus that destroys sensus communis and consensus that sort of enhances that. But I think at the bottom is what enables us to think about the fact of being born into the world, and being born, and possibility of first and foremost as a new event. And if you think about having been born as a new event that depends on the gift, welcome, labor of others, that means that it cannot be biological determinism of any kind, even though, and therefore it can never depend on, even though it might emerge as a consensus of this imaginary war between the hostile womb and fragile fetus that somehow has to be protected from the hostile mother, right? So I think Arendtian notion of the condition of having been born as dependent on others is so threatening to the ontology of self-sufficient individuation that I think that a lot of pro-life movements want to destroy that sense of deep dependency on the other and destroy the maternal agency, imaginative, bodily, and desiring agency to give or not to give birth. It's a gift. And as a gift, it cannot be forced or compelled or treated as biological destiny, and so forth. So that's why I found this notion of the fragility of having been born as a marker of finitude on the other side that is maybe feeding the venus and this emotional, affective, almost intensity of reclaiming the right to absolute existence. That's where the mortality and natality come together in a certain way from the very beginning, and you cannot separate one from the other.
And then there's also the idea of natality being an ongoing process, and the question of the natality of the mother, the ongoing natality of the mother being altered, interrupted, dominated by the by ideology, really.
A compulsory, right? Destructive mechanisms of power. And that's another reason why I find, both in the context of the reproductive justice and in this most capacious way, and in the context of the topics that we are discussing today, this emphasis that Arendtian emphasis on the sort of fragility of the ontology of natality that can be destroyed and historically had been destroyed, whether we have in the United States conditions of slavery and immigration, forced labor in Europe by the anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and continuing destruction of that by refugee crisis and so forth. I sort of, I'm perplexed by, for instance, watching right now situation in Poland, that the same hostility to this refugees from Iraq by the extreme right, that the nation needs to be defended, all right, called him, against this invasion of the parasites, of those immigrants who are like threatening, etc., by the country that lived in for 200 years in diasporic condition itself, right? The same group that's so violently not welcoming, opposing, is most xenophobic in relation to immigrants or migrants or refugees, is at the same time the most viciously pro-life, espousing pro-life policies. So if people and pregnant women are dying for the border, that does not matter if, you know, if we control the reproductive politics of our women. And I find it horrifying. And I think that's the double edge of the pro-life movement. Or in the United States, oftentimes you have a conjunction, not all, that proponents of gun ownership are also the proponents of pro-life. Yeah, that's another sort of rich irony.
And strategic labeling.
As strategic labeling. And this pro-life position, I think I'm ranting, and that's kind of takes us. the sort of destroys the reproductive justice to the right to give or not to give birth to the new beings in a safe world, when these beings can flourish and when the ontology of natality can flourish, right? It begins at conception and ends at birth, and then, you know, we don't care of these beings as new beginners.
Thank you, Eva, so much. It was very precisely articulated thoughts, you know.
Mm-hmm.
We all need to hear a philosopher at work, as you have demonstrated.
Beautifully done. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I do not want to take more of your time. You have already given us so much. And I would like to thank everybody for being here again. It's been great to have you, and hopefully we can see each other again in the near future.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the work that is still new to me. I think that humanists, artists, and philosophers need to be engaged in the front lines of in our engagement of technologies, which we don't often understand, because they are this is the architecture of our wordlessness in which we are living. And for me, the two twin dangers is, and they are combined, in fact, is ecological catastrophe and digital wordlessness, and automation and data and computerization feeds into ecological disaster in major way, and vice versa. So thank you for the opportunity to present the work in process.
Thank you, Eva. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you, Eva. What a great honor to have you today.
Thank you, George.
Thank you,
Karen.
Thank you, Simonetta. Thank you, George. Thank you, Eva.
Yeah. Ciao, everybody.
Thanks, and see you soon.